Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is number 2 of 3 in which I'm making a little Christmas gift set for a friend. So last week I made a makeup bag and this week's video is a matching eye mask. So without further ado, let's get started. Starting with the pattern, I've given myself a nice straight edge there, and from that edge I'm measuring 4 inches. Back to that edge again and measuring down 1 3/4 inches. And then on the side 3.5 inches. Just marking the center at the bottom, and now to round off all of those straight edges. Just using my hip curve here, but you could do this by eye. And then lastly, just to curve off that top edge. Giving myself a little notch just at the bottom of that curve. That's where I'll be adding the elastic. And now just to add seam allowance and cut this out. And for labeling, I'm going to cut 1 in outer fabric and 1 in lining, both on the fold. And then to give the eye mask the substance I want, I'm also going to add some fleece to the inside. So I've just traced off exactly the same pattern. The only difference here is I've omitted the seam allowance. That will just help to reduce the bulk along the seam lines. And now onto that elastic casing. So I've given myself a straight edge and I'm just going to draw a rectangle 9.5 inches by 2.5 inches. Adding a 1 centimeter seam allowance on one edge, and I'm going to cut 1 in outer fabric on the fold. So that completes the pattern. Onto the fabric. So for the outer, I'm using the same fabric I used in my last video, as this is a little set I'm making for a friend. So I'm using this silk kimono fabric, silk lining, and then for the substance, as I mentioned, this press-on fleece. So on to the cutting out. My fabric underneath is on the fold. Adding my fleece. So first of all, just lightly pressing this into place, glue side of fleece to wrong side of fabric. And then turning it over and pressing from the outside. And before I do anything else, I'm going to leave this to cool. So while that's happening, I'll move on to my elastic casing. My fabric underneath is on the fold, and the first thing to do here is just to press this into place. So folding in half along its length, giving myself a nice crease line, and then folding the raw edges in towards that crease line on both sides. I'll finish that off camera, and now I'm ready to run a stitch line right along the edge the whole way along. Back stitching to start, trying to keep those edges lined up. And back stitching to finish. It just needs a bit of a press. And for elastic, I'm using this hemline brand. I'm cutting myself a little strip. It's 10.5 inches long. And I've just attached a darning needle to one end to help me feed my elastic through the casing. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. So now just to run a stitch line along the edge to secure that elastic in place. So that's now ready to be added to the mask. Lining it up with my notches. And stitching here within my seam allowance. That will make sure this stitch line is hidden. And of course I've done exactly the same on the other side. Now I want to add some piping here, and I'm doing this for two reasons. One is I want to add a little bit of a decorative touch, and two, I've got 3 gifts in this little set and I want to tie them all in together. So I've cut myself a strip of the lining fabric on the bias, and I'm going to make myself some piping with this craft cotton. Using my piping foot, and I've just popped that craft cotton right in the center. Made sure my edges have lined up, placing my needle right along the edge of the cotton and trying to make sure that my fabric and my cotton cord remain in the same groove on my foot the whole way along. So that's my piping complete and ready to be added to the mask. So I'm going to start at the center on the top. Same thing again here, I'm trying to make sure that the piping remains in the same groove on my foot the whole way around. And then when I come back to my starting position, I'm just going to tilt that fabric away from the mask. And sew right over the top. And once it's had a bit of a press, this is how it looks. Happy with that. So now this is ready for lining. So I'm just repeating the same steps as before. I've let that cool, and here just placing my lining and fleece combination on top of my outer, making sure my elastic is pinned out of the way and ready to stitch. So back to my regular foot, and I'm just sewing right over the top of the stitch line I used when I added my piping. I'm leaving myself a little gap at the top. That will just allow me to pull everything through to the right side. Back stitching to start and backstitching to finish. So now I just need to trim off that excess seam allowance. So I'm folding right along the stitch line and just snipping out a little triangle. I'll do that the whole way around. And I just have a couple more things to do. The first of which is to pull everything through to the right side and press. So that's that done. And now the last thing to do is just to run a hand stitch to close up that little gap at the top. So securing my thread on one side and then just picking up a little bit of fabric right along that crease line. And then a little bit of fabric along the edge of the piping, and repeating. And with that, this little eye mask is complete. I've got my piping all around the outside. I've got those 2 layers of fleece giving a nice luxurious feel. I've got my elastic with its casing, making this super comfortable to wear. And this, as I mentioned, is part of a little set. So if you watched last week's video, you will have seen how I sewed up the makeup bag in this set. And if you watch next week's, you'll see how I sewed up this little brush and jewellery roll. So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys next week. Until then, I hope you have a fabulous week. Bye folks!